Okay, my name's Evan Scheibel with CG Toots Plus, and in this tutorial we're going to take a pretty extensive look at FumeFX, which is a digital pyrotechnics plugin for 3D Studio Max. Now, if you followed my work at all, you've no doubt seen some of what I've done with this plugin. Everything from explosions to dust trails behind pod racers, all sorts of stuff. Just simple flames. You can do so much with this plugin, and a lot of which doesn't even have to do with fire. Just a lot you can do. I think I used this plugin once to make a pill dissolve in water. So just a lot you can do. It's a pretty scalable plugin, and so you can see other training that I've produced for FumeFX at my website Particle Flow. But we're going to do something in this tutorial that's completely different from what I've done in any of the training there. We're not going to pick something up and go through with it. What we're going to do is just extensively look at every little nook and cranny of this plugin, and all we're going to do is make just a simple flame. But in making this simple flame, we're going to realize that this plugin is very, very, very complicated. So let's get right to it here, and right on the screen you can see what we're going to be kind of working our way towards here. There's a lot going on here. It may not look like it from this, but get some pretty realistic results with Fume. We're not going to cover some things with this plugin, like we're not going to cover initial state and things like that. We're just going to work with the basics and things that you need to know in order to work with Fume. So this is what we're going to be working towards, is a simple little flame like this, but a very photoreal result. So let's get right to it here. So you start out with blank max, and I'm pretty sure you can get a demo version of Fume if you email Sydney Sadi. If you need somebody to put a word in for you, send me an email, and I can maybe get you a demo if they don't give it to you. So let's get started here. Blank max, if you have the plugin installed, then we're going to just work right from the ground up. So just bear with me if you know what we're going to cover here, but eventually you'll learn something, trust me. So I'm just going to expand my viewport here, so we're working with just our perspective view. And the first thing you want to do when working with Fume is build a container. So what I'm going to do is come to my Create panel, I'm going to roll this out, and I'm going to come down to FumeFX. And we only have one option, which is the FumeFX container. Now I'm just going to drag this out. About so big. Now it's important to know when you're working with a container that you don't want to make it too big, and you don't want the dimensions to be too I guess you could say skewed. In other words, you don't want it to be, let's say, 20 meters long, 20 meters wide, and 36 centimeters high. It's just going to throw a lot of things off for you. And so what you want to do is make it about uniform. So this should work pretty good for just what we're going to do. And this container is extremely important, and you need to do all your simulation inside of it, because with this container it gives 3D Studio Max the information it needs to not have to calculate infinite space. So it contains the simulation area within this box. That way you'll get simulations that you can actually do on any computer in a fair amount of time. Because if you had to calculate a volumetric effect for infinite space, it would just never calculate, never simulate. So this localizes the simulation to a defined area, which is you need to do that. And then there's a few different source types that we're going to look at. And to get to the sources for FumeFX, which is the second most important thing, is you go to your helpers menu in the Create panel, and again you fly this out and go to FumeFX. Now there's four different options here: simple source, object source, particle source and gravity vector. We're not going to cover the gravity vector too much in this tutorial. Well, not at all, I should say. Maybe in later training videos, either on particle flow or even here at CG2, so we'll go into that. That's for a little more complicated effects. You can use it to simulate wind and different things like that. What we're going to look at is the simple source. So just click on simple source and then drag that out in, just like any other geometry, drag that into the viewport. Maybe pull it up because you want that to be inside the box, inside the container, the little box you made there. So that looks good. And that's going to act as the place where the fuel is emitted. And what I mean by fuel is this works just like firewood. A lot of the settings are based around, simulating realistic fire, not just in the result, but also in creating it. So the effect is accomplished by, setting up fuel, burn rate, heat, heat production, dissipation of the smoke, different things like that. So you need to know a little bit about combustion. Not the software application, but physical combustion in real life to really get the most out of FumeFX. But it's not that complicated. We'll cover things that you need to know in this video. Okay, so this simple source is going to act as this kind of the source area and where the flame would be emitted, you could say. So pretty much an emitter, for lack of better terms. Okay, and from here, there's a couple things you can do. You can either just highlight this, or I should say highlight your box here and then go to your edit panel, and you can work with the plugin from here, which I don't recommend. You can also get to some of your properties here from your edit panel. Now, I don't recommend that, however. What I recommend is using the really handy menu that comes with FumeFX, the floater. They call it the floater display. And I have it set up as a toolbar right here, so I just hit this and out comes my floater display. Let me resize it so you can see it. And this has all of the, well, pretty much everything that you're going to need to work with FumeFX is right here contained in this floater. Now, there's a few things that you can't get to from the floater. Like if I want to change the shape of my source here, I have to do that from my edit panel. So for this one, we're going to use a box. Now, this is kind of the way the fuel is going to be. Well, inside this bounding box right here is where the fuel is going to be contained. So naturally, the shape that you use is going to really drastically affect the type of flame or the type of explosion, the type of smoke that you get. And when simulating natural phenomena, a big thing that you want to keep in mind is the more random it is, the better. Because in nature you don't really see too much uniformity. You see a lot of randomness. So when we use a box like this, we're going to get a better, more randomness in our flame because it's just going to emit differently out the sides and the top, and it's going to give us a lot more randomness without having to really jack up turbulence and noise and things like that. So that'll work for us good. And we're going to change the height. We're going to bring that down a bit, and that should do it. It looks pretty good. All right. Excuse me if I clear my throat a few times. There's a cold going around, so sorry about that. Okay, so back to the floater menu here, and once you bring the floater menu up, when you bring it up, if you go off here, when you highlight your bounding box or your container, again, it'll automatically bring up the floater menu. Now, a couple things about the floater menu here. You can either set up a FumeFX menu, or what I choose to do is to right click here, go to customize, and create a little toolbar here. I'm not going to do that because I already have it here, but just search through your toolbar options for FumeFX and just drag it out here, and then you'll have a little button there. I usually bring my floater display button and my start simulation button out here into its own toolbar. Okay, so first we're just going to, now in this floater, we're just going to go through every tab. So we're going to go through General, Simulation, Rendering, Illumination, Object Source. And we're not going to cover every little thing in detail, but we will get a really extensive, in-depth knowledge that we can use to expand our design. So let's go to the General tab and let's take a look at the simulation area settings right here. Now spacing is extremely important. The spacing, if you see here in the side of the grid, where are we here? Okay, you see this little square here. That represents the size of the voxels inside this container. Now a voxel is a volumetric pixel, which is pretty much a pixel in 3 dimensions. Most of the time when you deal with pixels, you're dealing with X and Y space, or in 3D Max terminology, you're dealing with Z and X space. But with a voxel, you're dealing with 3 dimensions, so you have a lot more to deal with and to calculate, because FumeFX is, a 3D plugin. So we want our spacing within this container to give us enough resolution to have enough detail to make the flame look realistic. If you followed me on that, props to you. But in other words, we need to make the resolution of our container small so that we can get a lot more detail in our flame. So right now that represents the resolution of the inside of our container in 3 dimensions. So what we want to do is bring that down and make it usually the size right here, for testing, about 100 should be good for all 3 dimensions, or right around 100, and then you can boost that when you do your final simulation. But for now we'll just leave it about there. Okay, and that's the same thing. Width and length, that deals with the size of your container. So you can see what I might do is bring the height up so we can get a pretty uniform number here. That way we can get a better resolution, a little faster simulation times, and a little more predictable simulations. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the simulation area settings in the general parameters there. And you can see the simulation, it says sim up to 64 megabytes and render up to 30 megabytes. That's just the file sizes of this current simulation. Don't really worry about that too much unless you're doing huge effects, and if you're doing huge effects with Fume, you probably already know all about that, so you don't need this tutorial anyway. Okay, next thing you want to do is set your range, and right now we're just going to leave it at default 100 frames, but let's say you're working with like an explosion scene where you only need to calculate, where you've got a 3D animation that's 400 frames long, but yet the explosion only lasts from frame 220 to to 320. So what you do is you just set your output, your frame ranges in output and playback just to the frames that you need. For now, we'll just leave it like this and at default. Next is our output path. This is pretty important too, because you're going to be writing a large amount of files, which can equal a big mess if you write these files to like your desktop or to your C drive or somewhere you don't want them to be. So let's set our output path, and I'm just going to create a new folder. I'll call this tutorial, and we'll just create this right in here, and I'll create let's say and then an underscore. The reason I do an underscore is because when Fume simulates this, it's going to simulate the name within a number afterwards, and depending I guess on your naming convention, if you work at a studio, or if you have a pipeline of your own at your house, depending on your naming convention will depend on how you do this. For mine, I always just do the name and then an underscore so that the number will be separate, and then leave the save as type alone, and then just hit save, and that sets your default, or your output path, I mean. And then everything else should be fine. We already covered playback range. And then remember, because you're going to have to come back to your grid spacing, you're going to have to come back to this later on when you do your final simulation. Alright, now let's do a simulation right now. We'll just run it to see what it looks like default at with obviously our spacing change. So what I'm going to do is hit this play button up here, and you can see it just speeds through. Now you're probably saying, wow, that was quick, you must have a good computer. Well, actually, let me bring this over here. You'll see that nothing happened. Now nothing happened because we have to do something first. And what we do is come to our Object Source tab, and we really don't have too many settings here right now. But what we're going to do is, you have these here. We're going to use this right here, the pick icon, and we're going to click that, and then we're going to pick our object, or our simple source there. And now it's going to bring up our source parameters in here. And what we just did is we added this source to the simulation. So now that we've done that, FumeFX is going to take this source into account and simulate that, whereas before it didn't. That's why it went so quick. So you can see we have our settings here. I take back what I said before. These settings are available in your floater display. So we have this here. Now these three things here, the fuel, the temperature, and the smoke, this is just the amount of each. So like smoke, I usually set that a little higher than default. So I'm going to set it to 3. I'm not going to go too crazy because we're doing a tutorial here. So 3 should be okay. And mapping, we'll look at that. We'll just explain what that is in a bit. And then we have, you see this box here that says set. If you click on this, you have 3 options. Channel is disabled, which means it won't simulate that. Or you have the add values to voxel or set values in the voxel. Now, essentially what this changes is, if you choose add values to voxel, what it's going to do is simulate the voxel and then add that value to it, which can give slower simulation times, but it's also not as accurate because it simulates it, adds it, and then the effect takes place. So usually set values in the voxel is pretty good in what you want to do, because that, as it simulates the voxel, the values are already there, which gives for 1, faster simulation, and 2, more accurate simulation. So just usually, unless you're doing something specific, go ahead and leave it in that. And you have the same things for each. Fuel is just what is going to be burned, So temperature is how hot that's going to be. And you can see you have your amount set to 300. That means anything under 300 isn't going to ignite the fuel. And we'll see why that's important a little later. And probably there's going to be a follow-up tutorial to this one, where we might deal with that a little more, and you'll see why that's important. And then the smoke, we just looked at what that is. Okay, so now if we run the simulation, you're going to see it goes a bit slower. And if you hit this little light switch button here, you'll see it brings up a preview. Now we're not getting very good results here because our settings are just all at default. So let's let this sim for a bit, and then I'll hit stop. Now you have, when you're simulating like that, you have the stop and the cancel. If you choose stop, what it's going to do is stop at the next frame, so you'll be able to view your simulation. If you hit cancel, what it's going to do is just cancel that out. Okay, so now let me make this a bit smaller here. So now you can see what we've got. And if I zoom in here and then refresh this, you can see what we're dealing with here. It doesn't look very good, but you can see the potential already. Okay, so let's go back to our simulation tab and just fly through this, just so we don't have a long tutorial here. Okay, quality, what that is just the quality of the simulation. Usually you can leave it default. I'm going to put it at 10. It doesn't really put a big hit to your simulation times. Now, maximum iterations is just the iterations of the simulation. So usually 200 is way too many. Why that's the default, I'm not sure. You could set that down to about 80, unless you're doing a really fast simulation, like if you're simulating a jet engine on a moving plane or a rocket or something like that. You want to have more iterations and also more simulation steps. In essence, what that is subframe sampling, which is usually what we have it set to at simulation steps being 1 and a low iteration count is every frame it's going to simulate once, and it's also only going to do an 80 iteration simulation. If you set the simulation steps at 2 and the iterations higher, you're going to begin to simulate in, you could say, subframe, which it will do 2 simulations, or it'll calculate twice for each frame, which gives you more accurate high-speed simulations. For this, we're just going to leave it at 1. Advection stride is pretty much the same concept. What it does is it gives you more accurate motion and sometimes faster motion. It's good to leave that default. Usually, maybe I'm just gonna leave it at default. You can set it at, you can experiment with that. at will. Cubic interpolation, I've never found a need for that. I don't really know what it does because I've never used it. Time scale. This is pretty important. One is just real time. Let's say you're doing a huge explosion. Something explodes, and then because it's large scale, it goes really, or it starts out quick and then goes really slow as the plume expands and gets bigger. Well, you can animate that time scale to go to, let's say, maybe half time or quarter time. And what that does is slows everything down. You can also speed things up. So that's time scale. System, you have gravity. This is mainly affecting the flames and a little bit the smoke. Gravity, 1 is default real world gravity. Everything acts as it should, but again, the more gravity you have, the more things are going to fall and be pressed downwards. The more they'll just kind of float around. Now, buoyancy is how much, if you know what buoyancy is, if you throw a ball into a pool, depending on the buoyancy of that ball will depend on how well it floats. So if there's a low buoyancy, it's going to float. A high buoyancy, it's going to sink, or the other way around. But the more buoyancy you have here, the more your flame's going to rise. All these settings work together. So vorticity, a little of the same concept, except it affects more of the motion. Velocity damping is kind of, you can use this the same as you would use in the time scale for large scale explosions, because if you have an explosion, it starts quick and eventually it kind of slows down and becomes less chaotic and just kind of floats around and expands slower. So what you can do is you can dampen the velocity. You can animate that so that further along in the simulation, you bring that velocity damping up and you have a slower motion. Now, turbulence is extremely important. Right now you can see we just have a flame that's kind of blah, it doesn't move too much. Well, I'm going to put our turbulence at about 1. And then our settings for the turbulence, or the motion and kind of the chaotic nature of the flame, all the settings for that are here. Now the scale, I'm using meters. I'm not sure why. I'm going to actually go to customize, and then I'm going to set my units right now to generic. I was using wait a minute here. Yeah, generic. Okay, and then I was using Maxwell render, so I needed to do things by scale. Okay, so generic units now. Turbulence, that's too much. You can see how the number changes. I'm used to dealing with Fume and generic units. So I'm going to put this to 1, and then I'm going to change my scale to about 7 for now. We'll see how that looks. Detail only goes up to 5, so that's where I'm going to put it. Again, doesn't hit your simulation time too much. Now, because turbulence deals with what's called fractal noise maps, in this case 3-dimensional fractal noise, but in essence that's what it is. The frames is pretty much the I guess if you've used After Effects or Nuke or any compositing package that uses fractal noise, the frames is pretty much the distance over which the noise will evolve, or the evolution of the noise. So 10 frames means that the noise will completely revolve or evolve over those 10 frames. So usually I set mine to around 8, which gives it a pretty realistic feel. That means within 8 frames the noise map or the turbulence will completely circulate or cycle. Blocking sides, that's if you have your container set to block the flame and bounce it. Well, we're not really going to cover that right now. Okay, so now we have our fuel simulation. Well, let's run the simulation now just to see what our turbulence has changed. You can see a lot. Now we have a lot more random chaotic movement in our flame. It obviously doesn't look too good because, you know, we have our spacing set really high. Okay, so I'm going to stop that. And we're going to look now at our fuel simulation tab or rollout here. Simulate fuel checked. If you don't want to simulate fuel, and this would be if you just want to make smoke, you uncheck that. Now ignition temperature is 100. Now remember, you have over here your for your object source, if we have it selected there, the temperature is set to 300. That means that's going to be the temperature at which, or the temperature that the source emits, pretty much. So over here in our simulation, if you have your ignition temperature set to 400, you're not going to get any results. It's not going to simulate because the source isn't going to create a temperature high enough to ignite the fuel. So you want to set your ignition temperature lower than your fuel. Burn rate, this is how fast your fuel burns. The lower this setting, the higher the flames will rise. The higher the setting, the lower they'll rise. If you can remember that. That's just because if the fuel burns faster, the flames are going to dissipate quicker. If it burns slower, it's going to give it more time to kind of circulate and rise. Burn rate variation, it's pretty much like putting a noise modifier on this, where it kind of just fluctuates the burn rate over time. But there's a setting for it there, rather than adding a modifier. Heat production is how much heat this produces. Let's say you're dealing with, you want to make this flame ignite another source and start it to burn. Well, you can use the heat production to do that. Make this produce more heat, it'll ignite things around it, and pretty self-explanatory. Expansion is how much this flame's going to expand. Usually 1 is okay, or right around there. You'll know if you need expansion adjustments because if you can see your source, like a blocky, like if you look at my video here, I didn't want to do too high simulation time, so you can see if you go through here, you can kind of see my source. Well, if I were to adjust my expansion and make it a little higher, my flame would expand more, which would kind of hide this here, but I didn't do that for that video. But essentially that's what that does. Getting some problems here. I hope we don't crash. Okay, so, and that's pretty much it. Fuel creates smoke. That's when the fuel burns, it'll create smoke. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. And then when you enable that, you get this setting, which is the smoke density. Now, I don't want to be redundant here. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory, the dissipation and the diffusion of the smoke. Really self-explanatory. I'm not really going to cover that. Okay, now, rendering is pretty important. Let's say, okay, well, let's just look here. Rendering, you shouldn't usually have to deal with this too much. Defaults are usually okay. Fall off type for the container edges. You can have box, spherical, and none. None's usually okay. Not really going to deal with that too much here. Post load, not going to deal with that. Volume shading, again, not going to deal with that. You don't really usually have to change those things. A lot of them don't have really too many options anyway. Okay, fire. Now the color is pretty important. You can either deal with this with just one color and use your intensity setting here to make it brighter or dimmer, like you can see here, or you can go to key mode and we can refresh this and you can now see the difference it's made. I'm going to go to keyless mode, take a good look. I'm going to refresh this. You can see the difference. Usually when just doing simple flames, I leave it on keyless mode and just adjust this color in the intensity setting. But you can see also some different things you can get here when dealing with this. You can bring this over. You get a lot of, you can get some interesting results, and you can change the colors by double clicking the tab, picking, say we'll pick a darker color, hit OK. So you can see you can get a lot of interesting results with this, but I'm going to leave it on keyless mode for now, which usually is good. And then you have this little grid box here. This deals with, this is the AFC controller for the fire. This deals with the density of the fire from the source, which is right here, I think. Yeah, no. Let me get this right here. so I'm not giving you false information. Okay, here's the source, and then here's the end of the flame. This deals with the density of that. Now you can also come in here, right click, and make a smooth corner. You can also choose Bezier, and you can, change it with the handles there. You can also disable this if you don't feel like using it right there, or you can reset it. Okay, now let me open that up again and change this back to what it was. Yeah, for some reason, okay, there we go. For some reason, we have problems with FumeFX plugins and screen captures. Sometimes they give us some OpenGL issues or something, I'm not sure, with the graphs and different things, so it's hard to get good recordings. Okay, and then map source. You can do what's called fluid mapping. Now in your simulation tab, you have to enable this. Where are we? Maybe general tab. Okay, well you have to enable fluid mapping somewhere here. Sorry about this, guys. It's right here. Well, sorry about that. Somewhere in here you have to enable simulate fluid mapping. I think it's down here where for some reason I'm getting an error in my thing. But yeah, when you enable simulate fluid mapping, what you're going to do is simulate the data that you need in order to apply a texture map, usually noise map, which gives you extra detail within your fire. We're not going to really cover that practically, just kind of theory in this. So when you do that, you can choose your map and your map source. Okay, here we go. Fluid mapping, and then your map source. You can choose noise or whatever you want, really. And that's going to apply that map to your fluid, or to the fire in this case, or in the smoke, and it's going to give you that extra little bit of detail in your flame without having to simulate that detail. So it'll give you a faster simulation, and you can still get the same amount of detail with the mapping. Smoke, the settings are really similar to the fire. You just have a couple extra settings like ambient color and smoke color. Now, what we have to do to really get the most out of that is in our lighting, in our illumination. Let me close this out. I'm going to add an omni light to the scene here. A few different ways you can go about using the illumination, but I'm just going to add a standard omni light and bring that up about there. Come back in here and bring back my floater, and now I'm going to pick the light just the same way I did with the source. I can pick it this way. I can also come in here and pick by list. Well, that removes it. If I want to pick by list, I just highlight this and I bring up my hierarchy, and I can pick it and then hit pick and push H on the keyboard to bring up the hierarchy, and then it brings up that. Now we have some settings in here. Now, multiple scattering, what that's going to do is simulate the fire, creating light which then affects the smoke. So the difference between the two is, without multiple scattering enabled, you're just going to have the fire and then the smoke, its own color settings. They're not going to look like they're intermixing at all. Where if you enable multiple scattering, it's going to look like the fire, the light created by the fire is actually affecting the smoke. The depth is pretty much the detail of how much the light's going to affect it. Usually you don't go too high because you can get just outrageous render times. Usually about 3 or 4 is good. And then the fire strength and the smoke strength is how much each illuminates one another. So the higher the fire strength means the more it will illuminate the smoke and the scene around it. obviously the last, same thing with the smoke, fall off, just like a light fall off. It's the same exact thing. Okay, so make sure that's enabled, and in our rendering tab, with our smoke, not sure why my UI is not working right here. Okay, you can see that I have cast and receive shadows. I want to turn those on. That way my smoke will cast shadows on the scene as well as receive shadows from the smoke itself, which gives great detail, and it will also receive shadows from the scene, which is essential. Opacity, again, the opacity of the smoke. You can use an AFC controller to control that over the life of the smoke, you could say, or over the area of the smoke. And visual fall off and shadow fall off, pretty self-explanatory stuff here. Now, the trick is getting these things to work to make a nice looking flame. Okay, so if we simulate this now, well, let me change my